Good morning to all of you here in the sanctuary at the First Unitarian Church, and greetings to all of you watching remotely. I'm Mary Johnson, and I'm serving as the worship associate this morning for today's speaker, Dennis Fisher. Dennis is a retired educator who enjoys the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, Cardinal baseball, theater, bike riding, but most of all, taking care of his beautiful 7-month-old granddaughter. Besides Dennis's sermon entitled "Click Here for Proof of God," in today's service we will be celebrating the joy of our annual flower communion and also honoring all those who mother. We welcome each of you into this home of comfort, spirit, justice, and hope. Here we seek wisdom beyond our own experience. Here we open our loving minds and to the mystery of wonder and the moral imagination. Here we transcend the day-to-day of our lives to seek truths, both meaningful and sustaining. Here we seek to offer a loving message that provides wholeness in a broken world. We are Unitarian Universalists. And we open our service with a prelude, which will be up there. Thank you, Joy. An important ritual in the Unitarian Universalist faith is the lighting of our chalice. The flaming chalice has been part of the Unitarian tradition since the 1940s. Unitarian Universalists have many different interpretations of the meaning of the chalice, including the light of reason, the warmth of community, the flame of hope, the fire of commitment, and as a symbol of religious liberty. If you are watching from home and have a candle or a chalice nearby, please light it now as I light the chalice here, and we join in saying the unison words written by the Reverend Claudine Oliva in honor of Mother's Day. And they are on the wall. We light this chalice for mothers and mothering, to celebrate those who have taken the task of nurturing a young one, baby, child, or youth, into adulthood, to celebrate those who have nourished the light of truth and compassion in growing minds and hearts, to celebrate those who have committed time, money, and energy to the growth of others in the world. We light this chalice to celebrate and hold dear this flame of love. The opening words.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak in your beautiful historic church. We're all Unitarians. We embrace uncertainty. Alone amongst all of the religions that descended from the great Abrahamic traditions, we embrace uncertainty. But we also don't like to be told what to do. So theme sermons have always troubled me because I usually have something on my mind that I want to talk about that doesn't have anything to do with the theme. So it's obviously Mother's Day, and I apologize, the sermon's not about Mother's Day. Those of you that have read about it know that Mother's Day was created by Anna Jarvis in 1907 to honor her own mother. But by the 1920s, Anna Jarvis was so upset by Hallmark, which existed then, and candy vendors who were commercializing Mother's Day, that she actually organized boycotts of the holiday that she created. At some point, she was actually arrested at one of her anti-Mother's Day demonstrations for disturbing the peace. She sounds like a really interesting person, doesn't she? She would have made a good Unitarian. Now, since my mother, the most wonderful human being that I've ever known, is no longer with us, Mother's Day is a melancholy day for me. So as a result, in honor of Anna Jarvis, I'm boycotting Mother's Day today myself. And the homily obviously is about an entirely different topic altogether. As Unitarians, I think you'll understand my contrarian point of view.
Our first hymn is number 1000 in the teal-colored hymnal. It's the first one in the book. And please join in singing this first hymn, Morning Has Come. And the words will be projected on the wall. And it's going, and please open your books. In our worship to place each service within the context of the larger sources and principles of our faith. While we are a religion with no requirements or creed of belief, we do have values which we support overall. The thoughts in today's service are drawn from one of our sources, the words and deeds of prophetic women and men, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. The list of the Unitarian principles and sources we draw from can be found on Roman numeral 10 in the introductory section of the great colored hymnal, if you'd like to read them.
I just did a sermon for the folks at Emerson and St. Charles, and they don't move along this quickly. I like this quick pace. I meant to mention during the opening words, I obviously noted that the sermon is not about Mother's Day, but you have to write these things in advance, and had I waited until this past week, it would have been a different sermon altogether, because we just had a Supreme Court justice write an opinion taking away a woman's right to have control of her own body by quoting a 17th century judge who sentenced women to hang for witchcraft, and who also set a 300-year legal precedent that wives cannot legally be raped by their husbands. That would have been the topic of today's sermon had the timing been a little different. This is so mind-boggling to me. Take away a woman's right to control her body, that's obscene enough. But by quoting a man who sentenced women to hang for being witches and telling us that a man can't be guilty of raping his wife, the man was a monster. And a Supreme Court justice quoted this monster to impose his religious beliefs on every woman in America. I'm still in a state of shock over this. I've been reading about it, and my mind is just blown. I cannot believe it. Quoting people that had women hung as witches. So that's my little outburst over what the sermon might have been. We're probably lucky that it's not that sermon. I have a quote reading, a very short reading, from Stanley Kubrick, the great movie director, who wrote that the most unsettling fact about the universe is not that it is hostile, but that it is indifferent. Yet if we can come to terms with this indifference and accept the challenges of life, however mutable mankind may be able to make them, our existence as a species can have genuine meaning and fulfillment. However vast the darkness, we must supply our own light.
Thank you, Dennis, for those comments and that reading. The second reading is a little bit more history about Mother's Day. Dennis mentioned Anna Jarvis, who got the official Mother's Day started, and Woodrow Wilson signed that resolution in 1914. But prior to that, in 1870, Julia Ward Howe, Unitarian, abolitionist, suffragist, and famous for her 1861 lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, began advocating for the creation of a Mother's Day for peace. And for those you don't know, one of our church members, Tracy Howe Koch, is a descendant of Julia Ward Howe. In Julia's 1870 proclamation, she wrote, "As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left at home for a great and earnest day of counsel. Let them solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace. In the name of womanhood and humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of Women, without limit of nationality, be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient, and at the earliest period consistent with its objectives, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, and the great and general interests of peace." In the next 18 years, in the next year, 18 cities held a Mother's Day peace gathering. In Boston, it was held for more than a decade, and some cities continued observing this day of peace until Interest in the Peace Day diminished around 1900, and then in 1907, as Dennis mentioned, Anna Jarvis, a Methodist, began a campaign to establish a permanent Mother's Day. But as we UUs celebrate diversity, and while we feel it is important for mothers to be honored for all that they do, we also recognize that celebrating this holiday we can possibly marginalize others. This gives us the responsibility of hearing the call to honor all those who mother, especially those who endure hurtful policies or who are weighted down by stigma in our culture. We celebrate trans mamas, immigrant mamas, single mamas, lesbian mamas, young mamas, poor mamas, and those who stand in for mamas. This holiday is an opportunity to take action to create conditions so that all families may thrive. And our second hymn is number 1031 in the teal-colored hymnal, Filled with Loving Kindness. The next reading is about the Flower Communion and its history. In June of 1923, the Reverend Norbert Kapek, founder of the Unitarian Church in Prague, Czechoslovakia, created the Flower Communion. For some time, he had felt the need for some symbolic ritual that would bring people in his congregation better together. But it had to be a format which would not alienate those members of his congregation who had turned away from other religions and rituals for the more freeing beliefs of Unitarianism. So he turned to nature to find elements and rituals for more which would speak to all, and the Flower Communion was the result. Each person at the Prague church were asked to bring a flower to church when they arrived, and there was a large vase for each person to put the flower into. And this symbolized that each person joined with the others in the congregation as a symbol of a united church fellowship. And as each person left, each took a flower other than what they had brought. The significance of this was that as no two flowers are alike, so no two people are alike. Yet each has a contribution to make, and together the different flowers form a beautiful bouquet, as you can see over on our table there. Reverend Kapek's wife brought the idea of the Flower Communion to the United States in 1940 and introduced it at the Unitarian Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, And over the years, the Flower Communion has become an annual event in many UU churches. Now, as a part of our weekly worship service, we take time for the expression of joys, milestones, or concerns. And there are some electric candles up there in front, and invite anyone who would like to light a candle representing whatever is in their heart or thoughts to come forward, practicing social distances, and light a candle, leaving the lit candle on the tray.
The meditation is a quote from Laura Stavo Harm, which I selected to send out vibrations towards Judge Alito. We have a secret in our culture, and it's not that birth is painful, it's that women are strong.
It's your turn. You're doing the message now. You're up again. Your sermon.
And men are space cadets. Those of you that have children know that the single most rewarding and demanding experience we have as humans is raising those children. I remember years ago being told how difficult it is to raise a small child. My own experience was nothing of the sort. Of course, there are sleepless nights and diaper changing and other nuisances that are part of the process, but mostly it's an exercise in joy and revelation and countless small moments that enrich us and our kids. I loved every moment of my son's childhoods. But a day comes when everything changes. We have only one rite of passage left in our culture in the United States, and in these modern times, when that initiation rite arrives, your blood runs colder than a glacial stream. I speak of the initiation rite when they get their driver's license. It's supposed to serve as a demarcation between childhood and young adulthood, but that's delusional. It's a delusional fantasy. When they get that license, your life becomes a daily exercise in terror. This is a thoughtful group. I don't have to tell you how many ways things can go wrong when a 16-year-old baby, yes, baby, gets behind the wheel of a car. Your own child would never consider doing anything wrong, but their friends, once they're wrapped in the adrenaline-pumping freedom of an automobile, are capable of taking our beautiful, thoughtful child into any sort of blood-curdling crime of passion. Your child is suddenly the captain of a 2-ton hunk of metal that travels 100 miles an hour down a ribbon of concrete directly towards other 2-ton hunks of metal, traveling directly at them. And in those cars are drunks and dope fiends and phone callers and texters and people eating two-handed sandwiches, putting on makeup, people reaching towards their cigarette pack on the floor, psychotics, narcoleptics, and tiny blue-haired 90-year-olds with glaucoma. They're all weaving erratically down the highway towards your beautiful baby and his undependable friends. My oldest son excelled at concealing his youthful indiscretions from me. I didn't know until years later the reckless nonsense he was up to once he got his license, and I thank him for that deception. My youngest son, however, made 10 trips to the emergency room by the time he was 10 years old, and all of the stitches and broken bones were because of his rambunctious nature. He was a climber. We became concerned that some database might alert the Division of Child and Family Services, and we'd have some explaining to do. Suffice to say that when he got his license, I stopped sleeping. I knew in my marrow that he was capable of anything behind the wheel of a car. And exactly 1 month after he got his license, 9:30 at night, a half hour after he was supposed to be home, I received a phone call. And it was one of those calls where you hear the first syllable and you know something horrible has happened. For a millisecond, I completely panicked. He had to be mortally hurt, and then I remembered I was talking to him, so that wasn't the case. But this is what came out of his mouth. Dad, I just ran over a man in the car. This was the moment that I understood how the endocrine system is designed to help us outrun tigers. I got a jolt of adrenaline that would have sent a rocket to the moon. I asked where he was. He told me. I hopped on my little motor scooter and drove on one of the longest 5-minute rides of my life. All I could think was, please, God, don't let my son be permanently scarred or go to jail for the rest of his life over what happened. Please, God. When I got to the accident scene, there were police and an ambulance and emergency lights flashing everywhere. I found my son by the car and quickly realized the image that I was seeing was different than what I had in my mind's eye. There was a motorized scooter, the kind that like a child stands on, only this one had a gas motor. Excuse me. And its handlebar was sticking through the windshield of my beautiful car. My son, of course, was in great distress. My heart ached as I talked to him. I looked over towards the ambulance, and there was the man that he hit lying on a gurney. And something didn't look right, and the horror got worse because I realized the man on the stretcher was missing a leg. I wanted to fall to the ground and cry. I determined that my son was physically okay, so I went to talk to a policeman. I feared my son was going to be arrested and locked up forever, damaged for life. So I introduced myself to the officer and asked him if he knew what had happened. And he said, yes, your son made a left turn, and the imbecile on the stretcher, who, by the way, lost his driver's license for multiple DUIs long ago, the imbecile was driving the motorized scooter with no lights on the wrong side of the road, turned illegally in front of your son, crashed into the side of the car. We've been dealing with this knucklehead for ages. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. This is not what I thought was going on. I asked, what about his leg? I was at an accident scene years ago when he was drunk and hit a car and lost his leg, so now he has an artificial leg. It's on the ground over there. I looked at the leg lying in the grass, and it sunk in. It hadn't been severed in the crash. My son hadn't torn a man's leg off. And I said, how bad is this guy hurt? There's not a scratch on him. He was so drunk, he was completely relaxed. The policeman said, you or I would have broken every bone in our body, but he was so drunk he didn't tense up, and we're going to take him to the hospital as a precaution. I looked at the man on the stretcher, I looked at the leg on the ground, and I thought, I would like to pick that leg up and beat him senseless with it. Surprise, he had no insurance, so in addition to scaring my son and I out of our wits, I had to pay $500 deductible to fix my car. So my 16-year-old ran over a one-legged man a month after he got his license. Tragedy plus time equals comedy, and the horror I felt that night can now generate a chuckle. Life is strange. But I'm telling you this story not to get a chuckle and not to amuse you, but because of the spontaneous prayer on the way to the accident. We all know of countless examples of events when people prayed and their prayers were not answered. I don't know if you know this, the leading cause of death is birth. Everyone dies. So we have empirical evidence that all prayers aren't answered. People pray for loved ones to survive illness and accidents countless times every day, and many of them do not survive. My prayer, spontaneously beseeching the Creator to not allow my son to suffer, was kind of answered, whether by divine intervention or more likely by pure chance. The results of the impromptu prayer are not what interests me, though. What interests me, and in fact is a mild obsession, is the organic, instinctual, primal need to petition some entity outside of myself in times of great distress. I've experienced this phenomenon on other occasions in my life. I am hardwired to be a skeptic in matters of the supernatural, and I have an abiding faith in science and reason. But oddly, like so many of my brethren, in those moments when life spins out of control, I find myself petitioning some force outside of myself, a force separate from myself. And I bet it's the same for many of you. We're religious skeptics until life spins out of control and our commitment to reason and logic suddenly gets wobbly. One Monday last summer, late in the evening, I was standing in my kitchen brewing a cup of tea during a mild rain squall. Suddenly there was a roar outside and the lights flickered, then they went out completely. I looked out the window and quickly realized an incredible thunderstorm, windstorm, had come out of nowhere. It's one of the wildest thunderstorms I've ever experienced. The rain was going sideways, tree branches were blowing past my window. I like to sit on my patio during storms and take it all in. I stepped out on the patio and immediately lunged back inside and locked the door. The energy was primal, frightening, kill you in an instant sort of storm. Scared the stuffings out of me. It was an Old Testament, God's angry kind of meteorological phenomena. I bet a lot of people were in their basements praying to survive. After a long sleepless night, I went outside to a changed neighborhood. Tree branches and debris littered the yards and streets, piled high along the curbs. I hopped onto my little motor scooter, rode around town to see literally hundreds of trees that were either badly damaged or completely uprooted. It was heartbreaking to see so many beautiful trees, many of them decades old, gone forever. Nature was doing what it does, the forces of natural selection at work, weeding out the old, the weak, the poorly evolved. It's the way of the earth. As the playwright Samuel Beckett once had one of his characters say, "We're all born astride the grave." It's no different for trees than for us. Unfortunately, the storm served as a cheap and easy metaphor for my own life. I'm getting older, a little beat up by the storm and stress of life. My limbs aren't as strong as they once were, and the miles on my odometer are piling up. Just before the storm, I pointed out to my dermatologist a tiny, almost imperceptible bump on my lip that I hadn't noticed until a friend pointed it out. The doctor said it was nothing, but he took it off so I wouldn't scrape it while shaving. A week later, I got a phone call while driving to visit my youngest son in Carbondale. The tiny bump was cancer. And not just cancer, but a vicious kill-ya kind of cancer. Nature had noted that I'd spent too much time in the sun as a child. Further noted, it weakened some of my cells, and nature began the weeding process on me. The nurse on the phone told me matter-of-factly that I needed to have surgery and time was available in 10 days. She said to be prepared for as much as 6 hours in the surgical office because they might have to make repeated removals of tissue to get all the cancer. Mohs procedure, for those of you that have been down this path. Because of the way they did it, they could only use local anesthetic. She said, "You'll be wide awake while they cut part of your lip off. Now, I asked what the consequences of surgery would be. Would it alter my appearance? Remember, I'm in the car, on the phone, driving along the bluffs south of St. Louis. Her response was, "Dennis, you'll never look like you did when God made you ever again." So my mind was off to the races. I was about to be permanently disfigured. Somehow God was involved. I drifted off into an unpleasant reverie. After what seemed like a few moments, I realized the Mississippi River bluff that should have been to my left was no longer there. And I soon entered the town of Sparta, which was about 40 miles east of where I should have been. Such is the effect of the gyroscope and the internal clock when cancer is abruptly no longer an abstraction, but rather a reality. I spent the next 10 days before the surgery to remove the cancer engaged in serious contemplation regarding the central conundrum of life. We're given the greatest gift in the universe, conscious sentient awareness, with the understanding that this treasure will be taken away from us. And not just taken away, but taken away on a schedule that's unfairness itself. Some of us get a handful of years, some get 100 years, with no regard to whether you're a loving, nurturing soul or a spectacular scoundrel. This would seem to be a design flaw of great significance. Should I ever be honored to meet my Maker, this is the first topic I'll bring up. It's discouraging to remain faithful to ideals, to passionately strive to live an honorable life, only to be told that a cellular anomaly the size of a period at the end of a sentence is going to weed you from the herd. All this while scoundrel politicians and judges, the owners of obviously dead souls, seem to live on forever. Where's this intelligent design I hear so much about? In the days before the surgery, I thought myself into a frenzy. My always active imagination was off to the races, and I worked myself into ever-deepening anxiety. The greatest description of a nurturing relationship I've ever heard is that a successful romantic relationship involves taking turns being the optimist. Isn't that beautiful? But I was not in a relationship at the time. I was on my own. I feared that after a disfiguring surgery, I might always be on my own. I was in no state of mind to be an optimist. Is there any word in our language more fraught with a sinister ambience than cancer? It's a concept that's ground zero for primal angst. I considered needles, scalpels, blood, stitches, pain, disfigurement. And it wasn't paranoia or misplaced fear. These were and are real fears. When I wasn't involved in anxious reveries, I considered the phenomena I've noted at other episodes in my life. Recalled the episode with the one-legged man. Recalled when my other son was attacked by a dog and had to have countless stitches in his face. I recalled when my brother was deathly ill. In each of these cases, indeed every time I've been involved in a terrifying episode involving mortality of myself or loved ones, I've instinctively petitioned some force outside of myself. Whether it was brain short-circuiting terror or an organic primal response to forces outside of my control, I found myself praying. Now, as a person who has a history of being passionately committed to reason, this is quite interesting, even unsettling. I feel like I'm betraying my team, the team of science and logic. But mortal terror, a fear of the void, is universal. It's a psychological constant. It causes you to engage cognitive algorithms that you otherwise would dismiss. Life's like that. When you deal with interesting abstractions, it's a wonderful parlor game. When the abstractions become visceral realities that can rob you or a loved one of the great gift of life, the BS is stripped away. Intellectual consistency no longer seems like an asset. Intellectual consistency suddenly seems like an enormous debit, a huge red splash on the spreadsheet of life. So I prayed, and I petitioned my Creator with great gusto in the days leading up to the surgery. Historically, many people have come to similar crossroads. History is littered with accounts of theretofore logical people trying to prove the existence of God, a strategy of making peace with the illogical need to embrace and petition our Creator. People suffer, they petition God, they backtrack to come up with a logical explanation for this confounding and even embarrassing descent into the supernatural. I've heard accounts of these brilliant people trying to come up with a proof for the existence of God. I had cancer. I was rattled to my core. I knew what I'd do. I would research these proofs of God and provide myself cover for so organically petitioning my Creator. So what do you do in this day and age to research anything? I went to Google. I typed in proof of God. I clicked. Well, I got a lot of hits, and I had to choose my adventure. I went with the old standby, Wikipedia. And there's a page titled Existence of God. And it listed the categories used by people to prove to themselves, if not others, that God exists. Here are the headings of some of the categories: empirical arguments, deductive arguments, inductive arguments, subjective arguments, arguments grounded in personal experiences. We don't have an infinite amount of time, which is kind of the theme of this sermon, so I'm not going to bore you with examples of each of them, but I have to share that it was quickly obvious that a central theme is that they start with a conclusion and work backwards for a solution. Reverse engineering an argument for God's existence does not build confidence in the strength of the argument. An example is an ontological argument rooted in deductive reasoning championed by St. Elsem and Descartes. Descartes' a hero of mine. It's discouraging to see how weak his argument was. Here is Descartes' argument. God is the greatest conceivable being. It is greater to exist than not to exist. Therefore, God exists. Are you convinced? Me either. My BS radar made a clanging noise. If I was going to find convincing proof of God, I'd have to explore further. One of the things, aside from my introduction to the man with the scythe, that provoked my thoughts about God had been my consideration of the demise of one of my favorite authors and journalists, Christopher Hitchens. He was famously a belligerently devout atheist, and as he had cancer, and as the cancer robbed him of his vitality, many people of faith suggested that as death approached, he would find God, which he found insulting. Nothing, if not a curmudgeon and arrogant to a fault, Hitchens fired a preemptory strike. He would not find God, he said, and if he somehow verbalized a newfound faith, it would be because of damage to his brain caused by the illness or by medication used to diminish his pain. So he covered all the bases to refute his critics, and consciously, as a tweak to the presumptions of others, equated faith to brain damage. This is a man that knew how to engineer an insult. Now, it interests me that Hitchens was quite wealthy. He had a large circle of friends and family. He was almost never alone in life and in death. It occurred to me that it's a lot easier to be a stone-cold atheist when surrounded by doctors and nurses and expensive health care, family, friends, and never a moment alone. The certainty of a faithless universe, it seemed, would be easier to maintain surrounded by such comfort. It struck me that a better exercise for testing an atheist belief system would be a situation where the atheist had no money, no health care, spent each evening of his waning life alone. Those last moments would be a real test of a belief system for someone who professed to live in a world without meaning provided by God. One of the arguments for the existence of God I found on Wikipedia's Existence of God page was constructed differently than the others and seemed, in a way, as clever as Hitchens' broadside emphasizing his certainty that there is no God. This argument for God hedges its bet, a strategy that's appealing to someone like me who's uncomfortable with certainties, whether they come from a person of faith or an atheist. The argument was from Blaise Pascal. Pascal, of course, was a 17th century mathematician, philosopher, and physicist. To call him brilliant would be an understatement. He made many contributions to math and physical science. He invented the first calculator, which laid the groundwork for computer technology, a field that's logic itself. Towards the end of a life devoted to reason and religious skepticism, he was involved in a carriage accident, stared into the void, and had a spiritual epiphany of sorts, a spontaneous vision that drew him into spirituality. After his death, his remarkable book of philosophy called Thoughts was published. In that book, thought number 233 has come to be called Pascal's Wager. The wager is fairly verbose and dense, but fascinating. Look it up online and read it in its entirety. But he did a digested version. He did a short version reduced to simple terms, and it's this. Let us weigh the gain and loss in wagering that God is. So you're betting that God exists. And let us estimate the two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Like the other attempted proofs of God, a talented debater or logician can find the logical fallacies in a moment. And yet, for a person who's been through what I was going through, well, it seemed a little more clever than his critics. Like the great atheist Christopher Hitchens, he's introduced a fail-safe mechanism. I might be wrong, but if I'm right, the bet pays off. To me, Pascal's fail-safe mechanism has a greater reward for someone that isn't wealthy, isn't surrounded by family and friends, and isn't so committed to nihilism. He seems to be saying, hey, we're making all this stuff up as we go, so why not make it something beautiful instead of desolate? Now, when I was younger, Pascal's wager would have seemed kind of silly to me. Cancer, the great teacher, has taught me I'm not as self-contained as I thought. I thought I was above and beyond such thinking. Turns out maybe I'm not. The weeding process of life is relentless. The most adaptable survive, but never forever. Another storm will approach, more trees will fall, and one of these days the weeding process will be successful for me as it will for everyone in this room. It's the one certainty that stands the test of time. And the process has hit home with me in a dramatic way. The void's no longer an abstraction. The man with the scythe has shown his face. Thus, I'm confronted with the central conundrum of life, the question that brings many of us here today. What to do with the too few precious moments that we are gifted with. Paradoxically, we don't even know what the source of the gift of life is. It's anonymous. But I know this. I know how we should spend the time we have on this beautiful, life-giving planet. We should find things we love to do and do them. We should find people we care for to do things with. We should strive to be our better selves by considering the greater good in all we do. What we're doing right now, engaging in a communal church experience, is an exercise in trying to be your better self. So bravo to all of us for being here. Spontaneous, unscripted behavior is a window into the spirit, and it's always worthy of examination. As we've established, my entire life, most of which has found me as an active participant in religious skepticism, I've engaged in primal spontaneous prayer in times of great distress. It's illogical, perhaps a result of fear or even cowardice. Pray I did, pray I do as naturally and organically as breathing. I didn't choose it, it chose me. My head tells me that it's improbable that there's a greater consciousness. But have any of you taken note of mankind's track record on the use of reason? I give you phrenology, bleeding, alchemy, egocentricity, the four humors, spontaneous generation, the blank slate theory, the static universe, and so on. All these things once approached scientific consensus. Reason proved for thousands of years that heavier objects fall more quickly than lighter objects, except that they don't. Human reason is so often wrong as to be laughable. I remind you that 3/4 of life on earth is invisible to the human eye. Most of what's going on in the universe we're oblivious to. Eastern religions teach that life is an exercise in illusion. Reason is lovely, they seem to suggest, but it should be handled like a serpent. One of the most loaded topics in UU circles, which is an inordinately educated group of people, loaded topic is the concept of God. The word God, if not the concept's been co-opted by a bunch of small-minded, boneheaded reactionaries, the kind of people that quote witch-burning judges to take women's rights away. They use the concept and the word God as cover for bigotry, neurosis, self-loathing, and too often stone-cold pathology. Because of this, some of our people, UUs, seem to approach the concept of greater consciousness with suspicion, if not outright disdain. Consider this service as one small effort to reappropriate the concept of God, the concept of greater consciousness, for those of us not burdened with Abrahamic certainties. One of my heroes, the great philosopher Spinoza, suggested a pantheistic universe, one where all matter, sentient and otherwise, is part of a universal consciousness. Many Eastern religions support this point of view. This idea implies that each of us is part of creation, part of something bigger than ourselves, without insulting our intelligence. This could be the consciousness outside of myself that I petition in moments of distress. As you can see, I'm alive, although for a week or two I looked like I was hit in the mouth with a steel pipe. I've not been permanently disfigured, although I have a visible scar. My insensitive nurse was correct. I do not look like I did when God made me. But I'm quite happy with the scar given the alternative. I'm at greater risk than the average person for a repeat performance, so I'm reminded every day when I look in the mirror and see that scar to embrace humility, to give thanks, and to embrace the moment. I prayed, and the outcome was positive. Probably no connection. Others pray, and their outcomes are not positive. The great anonymous gift of life isn't remotely logical or fair. But if we bet that there is some meaning to life, regardless of how silly that bet is, our delusion can become a beautiful, life-affirming delusion. I can only speak for myself, but I'm choosing a beautiful delusion.
Thank you, Dennis. Our last hymn is number 64 in the gray colored hymnal, "Oh, Give Us Pleasure in the Flowers Today." As we approach the time for our offering, give what you will for the church that has meant so much to you, for the church that has meant so much to those who came before you, and for the church that will mean so much to people you will never know. As Jerry passes around the offering basket, I make the gentle reminder that this community of faith is supported only by your giving. But stewardship is more than just financial donations. It is also about donating time and talent to help our church. If you can't write a check, please help our church thrive by donating time or talent to maintain the church and its grounds, volunteer for coffee hour, serve as an usher, help with children, teach in our religious education program, help with worship. Please give what you will with your time, talent, and treasure. All are needed for our church to prosper. You may also mail your financial gift to the church, or you can give electronically through the Givelify or PayPal links found on our website. Give what you will, for you are generous people. And please join in the offertory prayer. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. I have a few announcements, and in a few minutes we'll start well, I guess we're doing the flower service before my announcements. Okay, we'll do the flower service now, and then I'll make my announcements. Oh, right. We've reached the time, obviously, for the sharing of the flowers, and the flowers represent all of you here today, and some of us, not many of us, have brought pictures of our mothers and our people who were like mothers to us to add to the flowers on the flower communion table. When Reverend Kopek conducted the flower ceremony, he would say, "Infinite Spirit of life, we ask thy blessings on these, thy messengers of fellowship and love. May they remind us of the value of comradeship, of doing and sharing alike. May we cherish friendship as one of thy most precious gifts, and may we realize that whatever we can do, great or small, all of us are needed to do thy work in the world." And the flowers have already been passed, and there are lots more here. Please take some home with you, and remember the service as you put them in water at home. Now I'll do my announcements. If you are a visitor and would like to receive our church monthly newsletter and a weekly informational flyer by email, or want more information about the church, please fill out the visitor cards that are on the visitor information table in the fellowship hall and put the card in the basket there. Or if you want a name badge, if you've been coming a while and want a more permanent name badge, please fill out one of the blue name tag request form on the visitor table and put the form in the basket. There's going to be a pancake fruit waffle brunch right after service, so please stay for that. And thank you for those who came to work day yesterday, Wayne and Jen and Greg and Jerry and Robin and me. We worked inside and outside and to start getting caught up in the care needed by our building. It's been 2.5 years or so since we've really used the building, so we really need to do some tender, loving care. On May 22nd, we will develop a right relationship covenant after church. Please plan to attend either in person or virtual. And I will now extinguish our chalice. Please join in reciting the following words. May truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again. Dennis, you have the closing words.
The closing words, as were the reading, are from the great photographer and movie director Stanley Kubrick. If man merely sat back and thought about his impending termination and his terrifying insignificance and aloneness in the cosmos, he'd surely go mad or succumb to a numbing sense of futility. Why, he might ask himself, should he bother to write a great symphony or strive to make a living or even to love another when he's no more than a momentary microbe on a dust mote whirling through the unimaginable immensity of space? Those of us who are forced by their own sensibilities to view their lives in this perspective, that think there's no purpose they can comprehend, and that amidst a countless myriad of stars, their existence goes unknown and unchronicled, can fall prey all too easily to the ultimate anomaly. The world's religions, for all their parochialism, do supply a kind of consolation for this great ache. So, we should pat ourselves on the back for being here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Dennis. We will now have a postlude. Thank you all for coming, and please stay.